I have to preface this story before it begins. My great-grandmother was a great storyteller. She entertained generations of her families with stories of every kind. She would tell us of her late husband's adventures in World War I, the story of her stormy passage to America as a young girl, and some stories as mundane as single-handedly clearing the raccoon's nest from the garage. There were those other stories, too, the kind that would send us kids sprinting out of the basement apartment where she lived, and into the arms of our laughing parents, who knew she was filling our heads with the same guff she used to fill their heads with. The scary stories that had been passed down for years in our family. Among our favorites were the two monsters that lived in the crawl space under the house. But one story my nonny, which is great-grandma in Italian nomenclature, one story she told us was different from the rest. This was the one that she always saved for last, the one where all the wrinkles of her aged, gaunt face would deepen. She didn't recite this one like the rest of them. She would speak about it with her eyes looking inward towards her soul, almost as if she was reflecting on something deeper. Her other stories would change and evolve over time. She would jazz them up and change things as the years went by, but not this one. She recited this one the same, word for word, every time she told it. It sounded like she was reliving some traumatic experience. Whenever it was over, she would slowly rise from the armchair in the bedroom and retrieve the rosary beads from her night table drawer and pray rapidly in Italian, rubbing the rosary beads over and over a birthmark on her forearm. What always confused us as kids was that it was the only story that when we would ask our parents about it later, they wouldn't tell us it was just a ghost story. So here it is. Mame was awoken by dawn light burning through her curtains. She was groggy. Even though she had gone to bed early the night before, she awoke almost in a daze. She blinked away the sleep from her eyes and rose to begin the morning chores. She found it odd that the roosters in the small Italian village had not started signaling the new day yet, but nonetheless went down the stairs to fetch the bucket to retrieve the morning water from the well. As her feet slid across the stone floor of her small house, she felt a sharp chill in the air. She opened the back door and strode sheepishly towards the fell. Usually a spry morning person, today she felt the clutches of sleep and the night clinging to her mind, as if trying to pull her back into bed. Mame reached the well and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The water in the well, usually several feet down at the bottom, had risen to almost the top. It hadn't rained in the village for several weeks, so Mame knew the aqueducts could not have flooded. As she peered into the water, she noticed a bright white object reflected. She turned and saw a full moon, brighter and larger in the sky than any she had ever seen. Mame looked around puzzled and realized it wasn't dawn at all. Faint stars peppered the night sky, the clouds above the mountainous village, usually sailing effortlessly across the sky, now hung motionless, almost frozen in time. She noticed it was near pitch black all around her, even though the moon was as bright as she had ever seen. The light seemed encased in the night sky, unable to reach the ground. She looked around puzzled. How could she have mistaken what was clearly the middle of night for dawn? Why was the moon so bright? What time was it? These questions raced in her mind. The chill that was in the air grew colder, and she shuddered as she pulled her nightgown higher above her neck. It was then that she saw it. The village church, several yards in the distance, was burning bright with the light of several lanterns. It stuck out profoundly in the darkness of the night, like a burning torch in a dark cave. Mame could not understand why the church was lit up so late at night. The priests usually lit a lantern in the courtyard at night in case any travelers happened to be passing through. But this was different. The church looked ablaze. Light was pouring out of it. It was even brighter than it was on Christmas Eve or Easter. Even more odd was that the light seemed to be limited to the church and its courtyard. As bright as the church was, Mame didn't see a single shadow cast beyond the gates, nor did she see anybody in the town square that had noticed the church's lights. Mame felt a strange sensation. She knew something was out of the ordinary, that much was clear. She was a clever girl, wise beyond her years, and would never fall for the simple dangers and traps that befall most silly girls in scary stories the elders in the village told. She was adventurous, but would never run headlong into danger. Even so, she felt compelled to go to the church and find out what was going on. Her curiosity, or some invisible force, had overtaken her. She headed towards the church. Mame reached the heavy wooden doors and pushed them open. She was taken aback by what she saw. The church was filled with people. Never, not even when Bishop Puzo died, had Mame seen so many people in the village church. None of them seemed to notice the doors opening. They were all standing, looking directly forward to the priest at the altar. They were singing something, chanting almost. Mame couldn't understand what. It was in no language she recognized. She stood there, mesmerized by their hymn for several minutes before she noticed somebody she recognized. Her godmother, Dominica, was in the front pew. Mame could see her, but it was as if she was looking at her through a veil. She was clearly standing there, but there was something off. Mame couldn't figure out what. She began walking eagerly towards her. As she had walked past each pew, the people in attendance looked at her with venomous stares. Their eyes shot fire. Mame had never seen faces filled with so much anger. It made the hair on her neck stand up, but she felt compelled to keep walking. She hardly noticed that each person was dressed perfectly, the men in finely pressed black suits, the women in white dresses and fine jewelry. "Dominica, Dominica," Mame whispered as she reached the front pew. Her godmother turned and looked at her as if she didn't recognize her at all. She studied Mame for what seemed like several minutes before a look of absolute surprise and fear spread across her face. She looked at Mame with obvious concern, but still said nothing. "Dominica, what's wrong? Who are these people?" Dominica did not respond. Her eyes were locked on Mame, studying every inch of her. Before Mame could speak another word, her godmother interrupted her. "Mame, you are not supposed to be here." These words pierced Mame's ears. They stung. "Mame, you are not supposed to be here," Dominica said again. She could feel the words cutting her. It was then, suddenly, that everything came into focus. Mame realized why her godmother was telling her she didn't belong there. Everything suddenly made sense. Her godmother was dead. She had been dead for 6 months. Mame was with her when she passed. She remembered her funeral in the church, her burial in the crypt below town. Dominica was dead. But there she was, standing in front of Mame, speaking to her. Mame's heart was in her throat. Her mouth was agape. Her feet rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. The chanting had suddenly stopped, and eerie silence had blanketed the church. Mame's breathing sounded as if it was bouncing off the walls. She could practically hear her own thoughts. The patrons of the Mass were all looking at her now. She could feel their stares, each one burning a different piece of her. Their faces contorted into a horrifying mix of anger, fear, and sorrow. They were not the faces of living beings. Mame stood petrified. She couldn't breathe. Tears began to well up in her eyes. Her heart was racing, pounding the inside of her chest. The church began to spin out of focus. Mame felt her grip on this world slipping away. "Mame, run!" She turned and ran as quickly as she could towards the door. She noticed some of the audience began to move towards her. She ignored them and kept running, her bare feet skidding along the ice-cold floor. The door seemed like it kept getting further away. The harder she ran, the more it was out of reach. And as she ran, a hand reached out and grabbed her arm. Long, thin, and cold fingers made a full grasp around her forearm. Mame screamed. It was unlike any pain she had felt before. It burned, but not the burn of fire, the burn of frostbite. She felt the icy, numbing pain stab her like a dagger, reverberating into her bones and up her arm. She could feel her skin dying under the man's grip. Mame turned and saw the man who was holding her, his face motionless, and his eyes solid gray with no pupils or irises. She screamed again, the pain in her arm so great it took away almost all of her energy to scream. She struggled mightily and finally pulled so hard that the force that broke the man's grip threw her off balance onto the floor. She got up and sprinted towards the church doors and into the courtyard, back towards her home. Mame went to bed and did not awake until late afternoon the next day. When she did, she saw a sea of worried faces. Her parents, her younger sister, and the town doctor, who had all tried in vain to wake her up. She felt incredibly nauseous. Her head pounded incessantly, and a burning fever ran through her. Her arm was marked with a scar roughly in the shape of a handprint. It was the blackish-red color of blood, and despite Mame's terrible fever, it was ice-cold to the touch. Despite her sickness, what scared her family most was that her hair, normally a tremendous auburn, had turned a dull gray. No doctor nor the priests in town could explain what happened to her. She remained sick for a full month, and it took almost a whole year before normal brown hair began to grow back and replace the gray.